Good evening, everyone. I never like to stop the buzz and the excitement in the room, but we're going to try and keep to schedule in what is an absolutely packed evening. And we have the exhibition next door, and there's half an hour afterwards that we'd like to open it again for you. So we'll stick to time. And those of you who know my chairing know that that's what I'll be doing. So a very warm welcome to those of you in the room and to those of you online. To the Royal Society of Edinburgh. This is the 22nd, we think, year of the Peter Wilson Lecture. It was originally a single person. We now have a multi-panel. We've moved that way for the most recent few years. And it's a joint event between the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research. And the chair of SCRR is going to give you a little bit of background on SCRR and the Peter Wilson Lecture in just a moment. I'm Sarah Skerrett, Professor Sarah Skerrett, and I'm Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I also have another hat, which is Scientific Director of SCRR, and it's with great excitement that we've been planning this event, and my colleagues at the RSE have done all the hard work. Lee and I just rock up, and it's all organised, so thank you very much to Leslie Ann and colleagues here. I have a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Lee. Firstly, fire safety. There is no planned fire drill this evening. So should the alarm sound, please exit through the door you came in, or the alternative is through this door here, which actually leads out into the street, and you're to assemble in front of the dome. Please not inside the dome, because we won't find you. So in front of the dome, and we'll check names against those people who've come through. And my team will be on hand to guide you out of the building. I have a second bit of housekeeping, which is to embarrass somebody thoroughly, Professor Jeff Sim. It's his birthday. So happy birthday, Jeff, sitting at the back. And I would say that's commitment to the cause to be here on your birthday. So thank you for that. Just to reorientate us now, I'm sure we've had a rush day and suddenly we're here and, oh, what's this about? So let's just take a moment to refocus. So as you'll have read in wanting to come here, you'll have read the information. I'll just reiterate that for a minute or two. So Scotland's national collections are a cornerstone of our scientific, cultural and societal heritage. They support research, innovation, public understanding and evidence-based policy. Yet, their longevity often works against them, resulting in them being taken for granted. As funding priorities shift and short-term impact is increasingly emphasised, these long-standing assets risk being undervalued. So this joint event, the Peter Wilson Lecture, honoured in his name, will shine a spotlight on the importance of the national collections and what they reveal about key issues affecting rural Scotland. Our keynote speaker, Helen Hardy, Deputy Head of Digital Data and Informatics at the Natural History Museum, will offer us unique insights into how digitising and democratising access to collections can ensure their relevance. Professor Olwyn Grace, Deputy Director of Science Collections at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, will provide an initial response. And then it's over to the mayhem of our panel. So we have half a dozen brilliant people who I'll introduce shortly. But in the meantime, I'd like to remind you that there is the exhibition and you're welcome to browse that afterwards. Just before introducing Lee, to let you know that one of the things we love about this event is the ample time for Q&A. So there will be lots of time for question and answer with the panel and with the main speaker and respondent. If the online audience, if you have any questions, please type them in to the chat comment section on YouTube and we will have those read out on your behalf. So without further ado, as they say, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Lee Innes of Morden and Chair of SCRR. Thank you, Lee.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And can I add my welcome to everybody online and here in person to the event this evening. My name is Lee Innes and I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research. The Scottish Consortium for Rural Research has got members throughout Scotland, and The member organisations are universities and research institutes and other organisations that are interested in conducting rural research that is relevant to Scotland and also globally, looking at food production, farming, land use, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development. So it's a very wide-ranging remit. The SCRR Peter Wilson Lecture event was established in memory of Peter Wilson, who was a very distinguished agriculturalist, and he was also former secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So Peter was Professor of Agriculture and Rural Economy at the University of Edinburgh, and he was also principal at the East of Scotland Agricultural College from 1984 to 1990. He was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1987 and became Secretary of the Royal Society from 1996 to 2001. He was awarded the RSE Bicentenary Medal in 2002, and this is an honour for individuals who've given outstanding service to the Society. So this event was created in honour of Peter. And as Sarah said, the theme for tonight's event is Scotland's national collections. And as Sarah said, they support research, innovation and public understanding. And some of the challenges we've got with these collections is how can we use them effectively going forward and preserve them for future generations. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Helen Hardy, who is Head of Digital Data and Informatics at the National History Museum in London. And Helen has led digitisation at the National History Museum for the last 9 years and is currently delivering the programme on, it's actually, the acronym for this is DISCO, but what it is Distributed System of Scientific Collections UK. And Helen has also worked within the European Union on this topic, including research into the economic benefits of digitised collections. Helen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for having me here this evening as an interloper from that London. Oh, that's not the way I was meant to be going. Sorry. That way, maybe? No. Okay, other way. I think I've got it. Oh, have I? Slide 3. Slide. Got it. Not that one. There we go. Thank you. Sorry. Just got there in time. It's not every meeting room that has one of these. So I'm going to tell you a little story tonight about why we come to have a disco ball in our informatics meeting room at the Natural History Museum in London and what it's got to do with collections and how important they are and what we can all use them for. So we got our disco ball when this programme we dreamed up, the Distributed System of Scientific Collections, made its way onto the European Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap. And that was when my colleague Vince got this lovely decoration for us, which used to spin and do all the things. I don't think it does anymore, but it's run out of batteries, but we still like having it there. The day that my colleague Dimitris, who, as his name may suggest, is Greek in origin, stood up at a conference in Berlin to introduce disco to our EU colleagues, was also the day that we got the results of the Brexit referendum. So it lent his presentation a particular poignancy, and he ended up moving from us to the Netherlands to continue leading Disco EU. But the UK still is very much a part of that programme and still has perhaps the most large and significant collections across Europe, and perhaps the greatest in geographic and taxonomic and historical richness. Of course, some of that richness stems from our colonial past, and it's important to acknowledge that, but also some of it stems more benignly from the very rich history of so-called amateur interest in the natural sciences and collecting in the UK and here in Scotland as well. Disco EU is a programme to look at collections as research infrastructure specifically, and I've worked for many years with colleagues across the EU, including from the Botanics here in Edinburgh, looking at all kinds of areas from data standards to technical infrastructure, to human competency, to kind of say, how can we join up collections in the EU and indeed globally? And it's an amazing programme. It has 200 institutions in more than 23 countries. They've gone heavily with the music theme. They have the European Loans and Visits System. That's Elvis to you. They have the discotheque blog. So yeah, they've leaned into it. But they have one major disadvantage from my point of view. They don't actually fund digitisation of collections. So we had to come up with our own version, which is Disco UK, which is the programme that I'm the programme delivery director for, working with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who are the funders. Collections are important because they are often the best and sometimes the only baseline data for change in nature. There's two really important things. There are a myriad of things you can do researching with collections. Some of you probably do them and can tell us about examples, but there are two very important things that collections are used for. One is identification. Is this thing what I think it is? Is it new? Is it something else? Is it an invasive species? Is it not an invasive species and I shouldn't spend money dealing with it, and so on. And the other is distribution. And I mean that in the broadest sense, not just geographic, but the features of a thing, where it's been over time, what it's eating, what's eating it, all of those kind of factors. And these are the things where collections go back well before reliable observational records. They are also verifiable back to the physical objects. We can reconduct analyses. We can conduct new analyses as technologies evolve. So, for example, we can now extract DNA from historic collections. So they really are incredibly valuable as data, and we see that with the collections that have already been digitised. We see them being used cited in more than 3 research papers a day on average on a whole range of topics, from evolution and climate to agriculture to fresh water, the whole range of almost every important topic you can think about. And that was echoed when we did a study with a company called Frontier Economics. We looked at just 5 areas: conservation, medicines discovery, invasive species, agricultural research and development, and mineral extraction. And they identified around £2 billion worth of potential benefit, which is a 10-to-1 return on investment for digitising collections across the UK, if not more. I'll just pause briefly on what we mean by digitisation. I mean it as broadly as possible. So any creation of data or media about the objects that we have in the collections around the UK. In the Disco UK programme, we're trying to create as many records as we can, as quickly as we can, and therefore the digitisation is fairly thin. It's basic data about what something is, where it was found, when it was found, and some kind of 1 or 2 2D images. But there are so many other imaging types, analysis types, from 3D imaging, from microscopy in different light conditions, to molecular and genomic analyses. There are so many things that can add to these data once they're created. Also enhancements from experts in different parts of the world, from communities of origin. In a sense, what we're trying to do in Disco UK is make the keyring for each specimen that people can then contribute to as that develops over time. And it's also about doing things differently. It's about having that digital by default approach. In theory, these collections are accessible to all of us, but they're in a range of institutions. Some of those institutions have a research purpose, but they don't necessarily have natural science specialists. Some do, some don't. Some have a public purpose, and again, may not have access to collections that are in storage. So although in theory they're accessible, in practice there are many barriers to getting to them, and we really hope to unlock that. So as I was planning this talk, I was in our meeting room and I was staring at that disco ball that's been there. It's really part of the furniture now. We don't really notice it at all until people come in and go, what's that doing there? And I thought suddenly this is quite a good metaphor for what we're trying to do. If you think of that disco ball for a moment as a globe and all those little mirror tiles as organisms or rocks or parts of the planet, there are 140 million, there are more than 140 million specimens in collections in the UK, more than 10 million of those in Scotland. But at the moment, they're scattered, as I say, across these different institutions with these barriers to entry. So the little tiles are separate and they're mostly dark, in effect, one way or another. And the vision really is to bring them together, organise them, have that joined up infrastructure in the middle that gives them common standards, that makes them into a kind of digital twin of our planet ultimately, and something that can be brought together with other data, whether that's climate data, data about human habitation, data about land use, and more, to really understand change in that very nuanced way, not just to look at what's happened in the past, but about what might happen in the future. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I think, in terms of why collections are important and useful. But I want to bring that to life a little bit with a couple of examples for the remainder of the talk. This is a slide that I call Who is the Louse? And I'll explain that momentarily. When I first worked at the Natural History Museum, I've been there for over 9 years now. Prior to that, I was in the Revenue and Customs and the Treasury for 16 years, which is a strange way into museums, but an excellent background to trying to persuade government to spend money and understand what kind of business case they might listen to. So I arrived at the museum without much background in the natural sciences or in museums. And one of the first digitisation projects that we worked on in my team was lice on microscope slides. My colleague Vince is an expert in lice, but I think most people who are not Vince have the same reaction as me when they hear about lice, which is to shudder slightly and feel slightly itchy. But this project really taught me what we can uncover through digitisation. And the first thing is how amazing nature is. And I became a real enthusiast for lice through this project. Turtle dove lice. Turtle doves have long, thin lice that live in their feathers and short, fat lice that live on their bodies, which is wonderful. And walrus lice that are amongst the only insects that can go into the deep oceans. They cover themselves with a bubble of air held by the spiny hairs on their bodies, and then they breed when the walrus come out on land and breed. So there's all these incredible insights into how marvellous nature is and how inspiring nature is, but also this deep knowledge about how vulnerable nature is and what we might be losing. Because lice are host-specific. There are specific louse species for different mammals, and they co-evolve with their hosts. That's why the walrus lice, for example, are so unique as insects. So when a host is threatened, that's often very visible, but we don't think about their parasites, and that's kind of an extension of how we don't think about the effect of that on the wider ecosystem or those chains of what can happen. So there's a lot there to uncover. We also uncover some amazing stories in collections that haven't been looked at for a long time. So this is a gentleman named Meinertzhagen, who I would call a louse, but that would be offensive to lice. He was a multiple murderer. He was also fraudulent in his collections, and actually his louse collections provide a way of verifying which of his bird collections were in fact collected by him in the places that he said they were, as opposed to stolen from other people's collections and passed off as things that he had brought himself. So yes, here's lots of interesting stories. I think perhaps on a more positive note, one of my team lately, we finished a project looking at river flies, and she's been using those data to investigate neglected female collectors in that space. So there's all kinds of stories that we can uncover as well. I like this example. It's not just scientists, of course, who use these collections. This artist, Marion Hill, full disclosure, is a good friend of mine, but I don't just like it because it's my friend's work, although I think it's lovely, and I think she's lovely. She brought some of her students to our collections to see the digitisation and hopefully be inspired by that, and she ended up changing her whole artistic practice. She does collage. She used to do collage of landscapes and buildings. She now collages largely UK insects and works with a range of charities and educational establishments and councils and others to educate children and adults about local biodiversity and about the things they can do in their gardens, for example, to make a good home for insects. So I think that's a really great example of bringing together art and education and conservation on the back of these collections, particularly when they're digitised and she can access those images as a reference point to do accurate representations. This is a diagram that we call the extended specimen, and it's just a quick example of how many things there are in a specimen, and there's many more things than this. There are so many stories in each object. So in those 140 million specimens all around the UK, there is so much to get at. And one of the ways of getting at it is the application of technology, and the ways that that can be applied are really eye-opening now. A paper done on our digitised butterfly collections showed that they could do automated measurements in a week that would have taken a human 2 years. So they can look at a much larger data set, which means their conclusions about climate change and changes in wing size are much more reliable and much more insightful. So that's really exciting. Our own AI team have recently done some pilots, some DSIT-funded short pilots, including one with the botanics up here, which was looking at image quality and having an automated tool for that. There was another one looking at reptile skins, so enabling, the idea was to enable border force agents to be able to point an app at a reptile skin bag and say this was made from an endangered reptile, it should be confiscated, or it wasn't, you're fine. So things like this are really exciting. I think also knowledge graphs that bring together data from different collections and can show us patterns and trends and help us fill gaps are really exciting as well. So I'm very excited not just about the creation of the data, but about what technology enables us to do with that data. And that's one of the key aims of Disco UK. To come back to Disco UK, we have 3 strategic aims. The first is insight. It is this unlocking of the collections as research data, particularly to address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. So each of our strategic aims is both an opportunity, a why is this important, and a threat. Why is this important right now, oh government? So that's the right now with that one of insight. The second one is capability, addressing tonight's theme about collections perhaps being a little overlooked or neglected. So our collections have seen a lot of underinvestment. This is an opportunity to build capability, both in the digitisation and data mobilisation and in the collections themselves and understanding their importance. And thirdly, Disco UK aims to take advantage of a moment in time technologically when it is cheaper and easier to digitise, when the data we produce are even more valuable than ever, when they can be gold standard training data sets, for example, and when the research that can be done on them is even more remarkable. One final example for me to finish on. At the Natural History Museum in London, we've been working on a tool called the Biodiversity Intactness Index. And this is a tool that looks at land use and how far biodiversity is around the world from a healthy planetary baseline. And this tool looks at different kinds of land. It could look at farmland, at forest, at urban land. It can look at land that's the source of a supply, like a crop, and how different crop choices affect biodiversity. It can look at land that's part of a supply chain. It's really, truly something that I think is important. And there was a pilot up here in the Cairngorms using this tool to assess whether interventions would be successful, so peat regeneration and planting interventions, and showing which ones would be the most beneficial to bringing biodiversity back up to healthy levels over time. This has also now been something, these data have been bought by Bloomberg to go on their terminal for the finance industry so that they truly guide policy and investment and action in lots of different ways. The sad thing for me about this tool is that it doesn't include collections data. It's based on research data. It could be so much richer, and it's already an incredible rich resource that can go down to kilometre level, but it could be more granular. It could include more species richness, more geographic richness. And I think it just really illustrates that modelling the biosphere, that globe, and understanding the possibilities looking forwards and predicting the future. So there are already 16 million specimens at disco.org.uk. That's disco with 2 S's, as it is up there. Next year, once we complete business case approvals, we will start digitising in earnest around the UK, including a hub up here in Scotland, which I think the National Museum and the Botanics will join forces to lead that hub and to work with other collections here in Scotland. So I hope I've inspired you to ask how collections might inform your research, your policy, your practice, or just your pleasure, and understand why it's important to digitise them and to protect them, and to look out for the disco ball spinning in your direction. And with that, I will hand over to Professor Owen Grace. Or are you going to introduce her?
Well, thank you very much, Helen. That was really interesting, very thought-provoking. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the respondent this evening, who is Professor Olwen Grace, who's Deputy Director of Science Collections at the Royal Botanic Garden, where she's responsible for the preserved collections, including the herbarium. As a curator, she's very interested in the role of digital collections in accelerating specimen identification in natural history collections and new data to manage biodiversity. So, great pleasure to introduce Olwen. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the introduction, and to Helen for a literally glittering introduction to disco. and digitisation of natural history collections. So I'm going to start my response this evening with an invitation, actually, for those of you who are Edinburgh-based or stopping in Edinburgh, those of you online who may be joining us at some time. Please do come and visit us at the Botanics at the John Hope Gateway. We have an exhibition about the herbarium and the research it supports on until the end of June. So please do come and visit. So what do we mean by Scotland's collections? Well, here's a glimpse. This is not behind the scenes. This is very much a working collection that's at the heart of a lot of our science at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. This is our herbarium collection of preserved plant specimens. You can see from the cabinet, that's my colleague, Dr. Peter Wilkie, that most of our material, this is the bulk of our preserved collection, about 3 million specimens, are pressed plant specimens that provide a record of biodiversity that we reference every day in our science. But this is just one part of the national collections of Scotland. At the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, we also take care of a living plant collection. You can visit one of our 4 sites and you'll see many of those. We also have them behind the scenes in glass houses and on display. But Scotland's collections also include several other national collections. We have the National Museum of Scotland. Shout out, I can see you at the back there. We have the National Gallery of Scotland. We have national records, the National Library, and collections maintained by Historic Environment Scotland. So these 6 institutes take care of Scotland's collections. But in addition to that as well, we also have collections maintained privately or collections maintained by local councils and universities. All of these combine together to form very significant cultural heritage, history, as well as being of immense scientific value as well. And at this moment, I also just want to pause and acknowledge that not all the items in these collections were perhaps collected with consent. Many of them would have been collected in ways that we would not practice now. And it's important that we are deliberate in the way that we move beyond those practices. I should also just acknowledge the resource that is channeled towards the stewardship of these collections, the taxpayers' money, the generous philanthropic donations that go towards these collections, the volunteers who give of their time also to help maintain these collections. In the blurb, sorry, Sarah, not the blurb, in the introduction for this evening's proceedings, one of the points of challenge is this risk that we take such collections for granted. And I would actually argue that we're at much greater risk of forgetting about them because they are invisible. And when I say invisible, I mean digitally invisible. So here's a map, a snapshot of some of our collections from the herbarium at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. We haven't even digitized half of our collections yet, but this is an illustration of where they were collected. So every dot on this map is a specimen. The more specimens, the darker the color. And every specimen, if you think about it, is a moment in time, a moment in space. So a biodiversity record from a particular time, a particular moment. If we layer these specimens, if we layer these points on a map, they become incredibly important as a resource that illustrate to us change in biodiversity. They tell a story. They tell us how biodiversity changes, both in space and time, in response to environmental perturbations, in response to management decisions, and in response to conservation actions. Layering these points on a map together are our most powerful tool for looking into the past and predicting the future of biodiversity. And of course, the same is true of agrodiversity as well. And these points on a map can only be found in collections. And so from a scientific point of view, there frankly isn't a more complete record. The problem is that until it's digitized, we cannot access it. And importantly, until it's digitized, it can't be searched by people anywhere all over the world. So by digitization, we mean creating a record in a database and ideally also taking a high-resolution image. Here's another good example of another good scientific application of these digital collections. So some of you will recognize, and forgive me, I'm really focusing on the botanical. I'm indulging you as much as myself. This is one of the most recent and complete trees of life for the flowering plants, the angiosperms. It's a tree of life seen from above, if you will. What's very significant about this study is that it brings together, the tree here was estimated from DNA sequences from the nuclear genome of plants, which was quite a breakthrough a couple of years ago in terms of the use of a universal approach to sequencing the nuclear genome of plants, where previous large-scale studies of angiosperms have really focused on the plastid genome. So that in itself was a big deal, a big innovation for us. But the second reason this is a really significant study is that over 8,000 new sequences were generated for the flowering plants, and the vast majority of those were obtained from herbarium samples, so preserved museum collections of plants rather than plants living in gardens. And this too was a big innovation. It's innovative because that scale, sampling 8,000 different samples, 8,000 different specimens, could never have happened without digital collections. We would have wished for it for sure. But this is an example where 163 herbaria from 48 countries contributed samples to this immense sampling effort. It's a huge multi-author paper, and it's a big step forward for our understanding of the evolutionary past and the classification of flowering plants. But as I say, it could never have happened without the digital records and the digital collections. Beyond the scientific value of digitizing collections and mobilizing all of these metadata and how we manage the collections, I want to just leave you with the point that I'm sure Helen and I can both regale you with stories about the times that we've been challenged. Surely digitizing means that we can finally mothball these collections and give up on them. Well, quite frankly, the opposite is true. Digitizing is really good for the physical collections. One of the reasons is that every item, every case of beetles, every plant specimen is going to be handled by a human, which gives us an opportunity to evaluate condition and do some curatorial housekeeping. We repair the specimens, we ensure that the cabinets they laid away in are curated to current systematic thinking, and basically we leave the physical collection in better condition than it was in before digitization. In addition to that, we often mobilize a lot more data through the digitization process than perhaps was already entered in a database. So ultimately, the digitization process is good for physical collections because it means that they are more discoverable and they can be used in more of these applications that Helen has given us examples of, and the ones that I've mentioned as well. So I'm going to leave you on that note, that digitization is, frankly, if we fail to do it at this moment, when the technology is ripe, when costs have come down sufficiently to consider doing it at scale, if we fail to digitize these collections, we are failing in our responsibility of stewardship towards them. Thank you.
I feel we've already peaked, you know. 2 fantastic presentations. Thank you both so much for all the thought that you've put into them and in presenting them with us this evening. We're now going to move on to our panel discussion. So those with the names on this slide, could you come forward? And hopefully you know that that's to happen. Thank you. What we're going to do as people assemble here is ask them to introduce themselves for a minute or so, and then we're going to ask them if they have a comment to make based on what they've just heard, and then we're opening to Q&A. So we've had 2 more chairs supplied, so I don't know if our keynote speaker and respondent would like to join in the cosy party on the stage here. That would be grand. Thank you. Everybody in, let's all just muck in. I think this is the most we've had on a panel, so if somebody would like to take a photo, this is a record for SCRR, which, as I said, used to be a joint event with just one speaker. So we're bringing multiple perspectives now. So what I'm going to do, in the order that's here, is ask you to say who you are, who you represent, and any points you want to make about what's exhibited through in the exhibition, or any responses. After about 1.5 minutes, I'll get twitchy. So, Mike, you're first.
Okay.
Mike OBE, I should just say recently, yes.
Thank you. My name is Mike Robinson. I'm the Chief Exec of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Now based in Perth, grew up in Edinburgh in the 1880s. We have a collection which has been acquired over the last 140 odd years, mostly through donation. It makes it a tad haphazard in part, but also very exciting. And in fact, probably the highlight for me, I think, when we really was brought home to me, the value of collections, is partly that we'd almost institutionally forgotten a certain amount of what we had because it was tucked away and lost and various things. And it's only when we moved into our new premises 17 years ago that we started sort of rediscovering it. And it's been an absolute joy just stumbling over things and institutionally remembering those things that are tucked away, and hugely inspirational. I do believe that anybody with a pulse will find something of interest in any collection.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. On to Katie, please.
Hi, I'm Katie MacDonald. I'm the Archives and Records Officer here at the RSE. So my role here is to look after the fantastic collections that the RSE has, dating from 1783, when the RSE started, right up to the present day, and looking to the future as well.
And Katie is very modest. She does a brilliant job for the RSE. So over to Professor Nick Owens, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nick Owens. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scottish Association for Marine Science, SAMS. We like to think ourselves in some respects as a collection on our own, in the sense that we represent really the origins of institutional marine science by being formed from the earliest of the expeditions, the Challenger expedition, of which there are lots of physical collections remaining from that expedition, some of which we've got. In particular this evening, one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is that we're representing one of our own collections, which is the culture collection, which is the CCAP, the culture collection for algae and protozoa. It's one of the largest collections in the world, over 3,000 species, primarily microalgae. And somebody mentioned earlier in the talk there, actually everything was being rather invisible. Well, a lot of our collection is invisible to the naked eye, at least. However, we do have a microscope with us, so I'll be my colleagues who are with me, Mikey and Ceci, will be very pleased to describe more about the collection. Whilst we do not have the institutional recognition, I think, that perhaps some of the, for instance, the Botanics has and so on, we feel that we actually perform a very similar role within Scotland, actually, and also more nationally, in that we do provide this incredible resource, which in its own right has its own history. I won't go into the details of the origins of the collection, which is fascinating in its own right. But as a national resource, we are here in Scotland, and it is curated and for the benefit, obviously, of Scotland, but also internationally. And just one point that I'd like to add, actually, around the notion of collections and so on. Something that I'm personally very, very committed to is the notion of the curation of long-term data sets, not just physical collections of the sort that we've been talking about, actually, but sustained observations of the environment. So, for example, what would we know about climate change had there not been sustained observations of meteorological records, for instance. And just as difficult as it is to maintain physical collections, it is really very difficult to maintain a sustained observing networks and curating those data and making them available. And so I think in thinking about this wider collection things, then I think we should also be thinking perhaps more of data type collections too.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I saw a lot of nodding heads here amongst the panel and in the audience to that point, so we'll probably return to that during the Q&A. Professor Eileen Wall, please.
As loud as I am, I don't know if I'll carry for those watching online. I'm Eileen Wall. I'm Head of Research at SRUC, and following on nicely from the point that Nick made there, we are here representing collections and capacity, long-term capacity in terms of research resources that underpin the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme, and that covers everything from microbes in the soil, soils themselves, plants growing on them, animals and the farmers and how they farm and manage our agricultural and ecological systems. SRUC has been doing that with its founder organisations, including the East of Scotland College of Agriculture, for over 120 years now. And I just want to echo what Nick has said about having the collections and keeping them as living laboratories, lighthouse examples from an agricultural point of view is really important. And just also by having and maintaining them for so long and time points, how innovation can help us justify them again. So I'm here representing the Lang Hill selection experiment in dairy cattle. Many people before me have curated it for well over 50 years. It would have been closed down 25 years ago if it wasn't for omics and sequencing data. It might be closed down now if it wasn't for how that fits in to digital, data-driven and AI in terms of how do we inform, forecast and hindcast what might happen to our animals, our farms and our ecological systems. So the advancements in science helps maintain these records and keep hopefully justifying keeping them as living resources. But Nikki's going to talk more about soils.
And a segue there from Eileen to Nikki Bagley from JHI. Thank you, Nikki.
Hi, I'm Nikki Bagley. I'm a soil scientist at the James Hutton Institute, and I'm here representing two collections. One is our National Soils Archive as a physical samples. So we've got over 60,000 physical samples of soils from about 15,000 different locations. But also we've got the soil maps of Scotland that provide a huge amount of information and data and interpretation of those maps. Some really high resolution maps, but also I think it's important what we can use our data for, and maintaining in soils. Soil health is something that's actually really important and is a big thing. And if we've got an archived collection, we can go back and say, okay, we're interested in maybe an emerging pollutant that we'd never thought about. Maybe it's microplastics. We've got an archive collection. We can go and then create a baseline for that and then understand how that might have changed. And I think what's been said here in terms of keeping those collections living and actually being able to both digitize them and make them available to people, but also then go back and resample where we've got points to be able to look at change. And our collections are funded through the Scottish Government research programme and as an underpinning national capacity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nikki. That's rounded us off really, really well. So we're now going to move to the Q&A, question and answer part of the evening. So I'm hoping you've got your questions ready. We'll get to as many as we can. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And once it says here, made my selection. That sounds very authoritarian. Once I've said you, please wait for a microphone so that those online can hear. And Leslie Ann, who's there with one of the microphones, she will be curating the online questions as well. So we have a very keen questioner right here in the front. If you don't mind, it's up to you, but if you could say your name and where you come from, that can sometimes contextualize the question. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Colin Brown. I'm from sunny Leith here in Edinburgh. I'm interested in the provenance of real objects. A couple of examples. A few years ago, a Mercedes-Benz racing car from the 1920s was on sale about 10 years ago for £1 million. Now, this was at a time when Mercedes-Benz and that particular model was winning all the races, Le Mans and all the other races, so it was a very important car for £1 million. It came with a very thick file of its supposed provenance. And when that was examined, it was discovered that there were so many repairs and replacements that had been made to this bloody thing that there was not one atom of the original car that was for sale. Now, the owner maintained that it was the spirit of the car which was imbued. Now, I realise I'm getting laughs here because there's a room full of scientists here and I've mentioned the word spirit. Another brief example is about, generally I've heard this referred to as the grandfather's shovel. This is my grandfather's shovel. Is it really? Well, actually, over the years, I've replaced the handle several times and I've replaced the shovel several times. But the spirit of my grandfather is in this. So my question to you people that handle physical objects, how do you ascertain the provenance of a physical object? Thank you.
Who would like to kick off? I'm not planning to put every question to every panellist, so if you're itching to have a go at that, go for it.
I would say that with soils, they're actually used to ascertain whether physical objects might be from where they said they were. So, for example, you might have an archaeological sample, and then you might be able to say the soil around that has certain clays. We might go and look at them using, say, X-ray diffraction to say, or is that actually where it came from?
I am a scientist, but I'm actually going to take, and I'm guessing my colleagues here will have more on this, actually by doing this in-depth re-examination, a lot of what we're doing is not digitising or genotyping or over-analysing. We're actually collecting some of the social history and putting it in that context as well, and that becomes part of the story and every bit as important part of the archive in how we understand the car, your shovel, the soils that shovel went into, and making sure that we're capturing that for future generations as well. But I'm sure Helen. Yeah. Sorry, Nicole.
I think I've got one. So I think for me, it's interesting you mentioned spirit because it's very disconcerting when I arrived at the Natural History Museum and everyone started talking about spirit collections. And it took me a moment before I realised they were talking about formaldehyde. But anyway, leaving that aside, I think for me what's interesting about data from natural science collections is that those data have provenance in a physical object which can then be checked and looked at, and its labels and records and notebooks can be checked and looked at. And generally the natural objects themselves, and I am generalising here, haven't been interfered with too much because you can't take the wings off and put a new set on like the shovel or the car. You don't replace the engine in a stuffed whatever. You know, you might stuff it very badly, like there are famous examples like the Horniman walrus where they didn't know it was meant to be wrinkled, so it's, 3 times the size. But generally those things are quite visible and you can look. But what's nice about getting things out to digitise them is you discover things in the labels or in the stories around them that haven't been looked at for a long time. You can uncover things that have been hidden. So whether that's female collectors, whether it's communities of origin, where the collectors who have helped somebody who was colonising and bringing things back, where their names have been hidden, you come across things, you come across names, you come across histories, you can illustrate the data from one collection with another collection that was in the same place or with the same people. So you patch together a better record of the object by bringing those together than you do just by having it in a cabinet somewhere. And you can go back to the object and check, is this really real? People change their mind about what it is, of course. Taxonomists are always arguing about what it is. But, that's fine, because now we can genetically sample it and try that way of saying what it is. and add another label. Labels on pins are great. Pinned insects, we found, usually it's between 2 and 5 labels on a pin, and that's just about manageable, but we found up to 20, I think, including some lovely pictures of the specimen and half a dozen different varieties of what people thought it was. That's, if you're peeling them all off with forceps one by one to take a photo, that's a real pain.
Any other comments? We've got a couple more questions in already. So Sam and then Roger, thank you. Thank you. I have to say I don't know everyone's name, so you might be the person in the red cardigan next, you know, so apologies in advance.
Hi, I'm Sam Alberti with my colleagues. I'm from National Museum Scotland, where we are honoured to do our part in supporting the National Collection with our 2.5 million artefacts and our 10 million specimens. But this isn't about size. Not least because those 10 million specimens are only useful if they're accessible, and we would like to be more digitized than we are. So my question for those involved in collections on the panel, and especially those involved in DISCO that we're honored to be a part of, is what's the impact of digitization?
I'll try not to go on too long. So this was part of the case that we had to make for DISCO. As I say, we did this rather top-down economic study looking at those 5 areas I mentioned and showing there was economic impact there. But I think also we've got now quite a lot of statistics showing the demand for these data. And one thing we looked at, we did a study with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, the big biodiversity data aggregator, and we said, what are people, so we've got, I think, well, we've just passed 6 million specimens from the Natural History Museum on GBIF, and we looked at what are those being used for now. And what we found was, so those collections were 0.3% of the occurrence data on the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, so vanishingly tiny, even though there's millions of them because so much data on GBIF is observational. But they were being cited in 12% of the peer-reviewed publications. So they punch 40 times above their weight, these data in value, compared to that mass of global observational data because of their richness, because of what they bring. So I think that, to me, is such a good illustration of the potential. And they are being used multiple times a day in papers about all these important topics. And that's with a tiny, tiny percentage of the national collections digitised, no particular, let's say, advertising of that fact or kind of attempt to consciously engage people, no provision of, or very little provision of tools to help engage people and help them use those in new ways, and it's still having all this impact. So I just think the potential, if we can do critical mass of them, is huge. And we can't imagine it, that's what's so exciting. It's stuff that we can't dream up. I can give you 1,000 case studies, but what I'm interested in is the next 1,000, and they'll be completely different, I hope.
Thank you. Yes, do chip in.
So my response to that would also be that obviously we have these fundamental data that do illustrate something towards the impact of digitization, but actually, as Helen's just hinted at, it's going to be the future that really tells us about the impact. Like generations before, we now use the collections, we interact with them in ways that we could never have been predicted, even, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so what we can be very confident about is the fact that the uses and the value and the applications of these collections and the data will continue to evolve as technologies change, et cetera, et cetera. So from my perspective, I'm confident about the immediate impact, but actually I'm really interested to see what happens in about 50 years' time. I think that's where we're really going to see meaningful data, because most of these collections will have been digitized, and then the 10, sorry, I beg your pardon, 10. And that's where we'll be able to measure the impact against those metrics and others.
Thank you so much. Owen, Nick, you wanted to come in.
Just a quick comment, really, for us. I mean, Oban is a very out-of-the-way place, and not many people know about it. And so actually for us, digitisation is essentially existential, actually. You know, I mean, one of the things that we're very conscious of is that actually people, you know, our collection is now easily discoverable. And I think that, you know, it's utterly fundamental, actually, for us.
Yeah, I was going to draw slightly on Helen's comment that digitisation includes all forms of digital communication around it. I mean, that's certainly relevant to our collection. But I think one of the things we were talking about at the top end was the people taking collections for granted, potentially lack of support and funding for it. I think the thing that digitisation in all its forms offers is an opportunity to communicate and inspire people about collections in lots of different ways. There's so many more ways now to do that. I used to work for the Botanic Gardens years ago, and I do remember one of my colleagues had printed 2,000 copies of Hardwoods of Borneo, Volume 2, and he'd only managed to get rid of 6. And I did say to him at the time, you know, how many people in the world are studying this? And he said, 5. And he'd sent them all a free copy. So I think the thing is now there's so many different ways to communicate, so many different ways to inspire people, and you never know what that's going to be, in the same way that you're not always sure what you need that collection for, because what you're searching for could change, as we've already touched on. So I think it's also true in the way that you communicate and inspire people around the collection that you have.
Did you want to come in, Nikki?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's really important that people can find them, and then we can start linking up these collections as well, and linking up some of the results to be able to get a bigger picture of what's going on. So it might be linking the soil with the biodiversity, or with waters. So it's being able to put that picture together and get a better picture of our ecosystems and how they function.
Do you want? Yeah, Katie.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe bring a slightly different perspective to this. Both the speakers mentioned that at the moment storage is very cheap, which is true. I wondered whether anyone has given much thought to the environmental impact of digitisation. Obviously, there's a balance between making our collections accessible and usable, and maybe that outweighs any environmental concerns because the research that comes from them is more useful. But I think when we balance it as well between the amount of energy that AI is taking at the moment and whether that storage will remain cheap or whether that's going to be a concern in future as well.
Yeah, please.
So this certainly is something we think about, and we have to do an environmental impact assessment as part of the business case for Disco UK. And I think, yeah, part of it, as you say, is the benefits will outweigh the impact by orders of magnitude, many orders. But nevertheless, that's not a particularly good argument for not trying to manage the impact down. The data themselves at that Disco UK level are not actually very big. The data are tiny, the images are not particularly big by modern standards. The research data and the research compute, if you're doing AI processing, is much larger, and some of those data are much more hierarchical and complex. But even so, that tends to be on much smaller numbers. So actually, the footprint of this is big, but it's not compared to many other activities going on in UK science. It's really quite modest for what it achieves, I think. So I take some comfort in that. We do also look at, obviously, where our energy sources are coming from and where we're storing the data and those kind of factors. And I think as well, it's the energy used by AI is definitely a concern, but also that as well, as far as I understand it, and I'm by no means an expert, is coming down. And there are examples internationally of those models being made in much lighter touch ways. So I am cautiously hopeful that that will go the way of most tech and will shrink rather than continuing to boom. But it's a difficult question for sure.
Thank you for raising that dimension there, Katie. We have 3 questions in the queue. So firstly, Roger, then Ian, a couple of rows behind you, and then someone whose name I don't know, I apologise, the lady in the lovely dark top. So, Roger first.
Roger Crofts, Royal Society of Edinburgh and Royal Scottish Geographical Society. I want to challenge the panel. It sounds as though if we digitise everything, all will be well. But we know that there's a lot of information in institutions that we don't always know about. I remember that from my Scottish Natural Heritage days. We also know that institutions tend to be siloed as well, and sharing data is going to be even more important. A lot of the data you're talking about was collected in a different milieu. And yet the questions, as many of you have mentioned already, particularly the twin crises, but other crises as well that come on top of those. So it's not just digitization, is it? So if you had your priority list, and I'm knowing that some of you are charities, some of you are state-funded, what are your priorities to make sure that this data that is there is going to be really valuable so that we do have a science-led help to future policy rather than the daft approaches we're seeing from across the pond just now? Thank you.
So maybe not comments on policies and politics, but maybe the core of the question there. Who would like to respond to Roger first, Nick?
Yeah, great question. And I certainly for us, I mean, digitisation is just but a small bit. I mean, the real crux for our particular collection is the ability to keep the things alive, actually. You know, they're actually living organisms, 3,000 plus living organisms, and that requires, you know, people, stuff, tech expertise, and all the rest of it to actually keep them alive. And on the one hand, knowing what was there, and so on and so forth is a fascinating, you know, would be fascinating in its own right. Actually, it's virtually useless, really. And the crux of the value of our particular collection is the fact that actually you can take an actual organism and do something with it, learn what's in it that we don't know what's in it at the moment. And so, yes, we're absolutely going as much as we possibly can for the digitisation, but it is just but a small bit. And so for us, it's actually the ability to keep them all there and alive and well and healthy.
Any other comments? Yeah, Hank?
For RSGS, I mean, we're constrained, we're a small charity, so we don't really have a lot of money for digitisation, and it's therefore a bit of a challenge for us, but we've used very creative ways to try to get around that. But I think we're also conscious that we're quite big fans of keeping the actual thing in the first place as well, alongside that. I mean, and maps are a great case in point because they don't always translate very well to a digital form. You also can't see them in the same way and you can't experience them in the same way. So we're very conscious that for certain items, maps being probably one of the more obvious, it has its very specific limitations. But the other issue that we've had, which I thought I'd solved at one point, we do have a small film archive. But of course, the other thing is, and I'm very conscious of, not just the energy issue, it's about keeping up with technology. The film versions that we had originally made of our 1902 films, of course, have changed format about 76 times in the last 12 years. So there's also an issue about how do you actually keep up to date with the electronic formats too.
So the long-term resilience of something that you thought was future-proofed and not to be. Eileen first, and then, okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's a really fair challenge, and building on Nick's comments, I think the digitisation is a route in to see what it is and how it connects. So it has to be open. It has to work across our collections, internationally be interoperable for that manner, and link in to other potentially not publicly funded or charitably funded supported activities, because it has to inform what we do going forward. It has to inform what our solutions are to the twin crises, to sustainable and secure food supply chains here and overseas. So I think the critical thing for me is how it interoperates for public good, but also to do that we have to look at the private benefits as well. And secondly, again, keeping it as a resource because we're maintaining living infrastructure here, keeping as a resource for how can we use this as, you know, thinking of cellular biology, how can we scale up and share not just the digital information, but actually beginning to allow a wider range of researchers to do things that we just couldn't think of in our own little labs or behind our own little computer desks.
So Helen and then Nikki, thanks.
I would say this, but I think digitisation is a large part of the solution to the problems that you've mentioned, because we don't even know what we have. How are you supposed to know what we have? So if there's at least a record out there that's discoverable, whether it's for somewhere a bit more remote and obscure, or whether it's for somewhere that people think they know about, but actually they've got no idea because 99% of the stuff is hidden behind the scenes, and all they see is our dinosaurs. You know, it's kind of it's a way into that, and as I say, it's then a keyring for more linked knowledge and more enhancement of that knowledge by more audiences in more ways. So it tells us what we have, it tells you what we have, it draws attention to the value of that and creates evidence of the value of that, which I really hope can then be leveraged to drive other kinds of investment in the physical objects, in their environments. We can't pay for all of that in one programme, but it's an exciting possibility. And before we've done anything really in Disco UK, because as I say, we're still going through approvals, I'm seeing the dialogue change. I'm seeing senior leadership in these organisations pay more attention to these types of collections. I'm seeing organisations whose day-to-day business is nothing to do with natural science objects, but happen to have some, paying more attention to them. And I'm seeing that sense that it's all part of a global whole, that it has impact beyond the boundaries of one institution, beyond those silos, as you say, that inevitably exist. And digitisation has failed in the past. It has been done at local organisational level. It's been stuck on a website, and then it just falls away. The format changes, the website. But this is why we are trying to have a 10-year, £155 million national programme, because it's that disco ball where it's one set of standards and it's one set of formats, and it's looking after all of it as a national sovereign data resource with that level of recognition and as part of a global picture as well. So I hope that that will bring it to a level where it has that resilience over time.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Ian, and then we have the lady on the left and two more people have come forward with questions. And Leslie Ann, of course, tell me if there's any online. So just one. Okay, Ian, over to you.
Okay, no, thank you. And this is actually building on the answers which we've just heard. I'm Ian Torrance, and I'm now Pro-Chancellor of Aberdeen, have been for the last 12 years. And prior to that, I was in Princeton, and I spent $4 million digitising pre-1923 books and built a library. Now, digitising, when you have the money, is straightforward enough. The metadata is much more complex. And then the next stage is how do you house that material and how do you refresh it? And what we did in Princeton was we sent our data to the Hathi Trust. Hathi Trust, Hindi word, I think, for an elephant, which doesn't forget. And they had enormous vaults in California. It's expensive, but they refreshed the data. And although I'm not doing this now, although I am trying to help a person who wants to digitize 300 historic volumes or manuscripts, is there a British equivalent to the Hathi Trust? An organisation which is utterly dedicated to the preservation and to the refreshing of data sets.
Thank you very much, Ian. Does anyone in the panel have a response to that? If not, there might be someone in the room amongst our experts. Yeah.
So I can't say for sure whether there is or isn't. There isn't a direct equivalent that we're using, but there are very active debates both within our community as kind of the wider heritage sector about digital preservation, and then also within government and the research councils who are developing resources of various kinds that we will leverage through this programme because it's research council funded. So one of the things there is some of the heritage collections, particularly the National Archives and the Imperial War Museums, who have more film data, for example, and other things, they have put much more energy into gold standard digital preservation, and it is expensive. We have looked at that, and actually what we have for the time being decided, and it is something we need to refresh regularly and do more systematically because this was a bit of a back of the envelope decision rather than a fully worked out one, was in general, as long as these records are being used, we will notice when something goes awry, and it will generally be with a few of them, not with all of them at once. And it is less expensive to redo those few and redigitize those objects using whatever the latest standard is at the time than it is to preserve them for hundreds of years immutably. So it isn't always the gold standard that is needed. It is enough of a standard and enough tools to tell you when you have a problem and to do something about it. So for now, that is our approach for these data, but it is something that we need to keep a very active eye on, certainly.
Thank you. Helen, Owen.
Just to add to that, so one of the very encouraging things is that we speak about digitization like it's a new invention. It's not at all. We're building on 15 or 20 years of standard development. So just to echo what Helen has said, there are some very robust road-tested standards around digital preservation. And the beauty of what we're doing at scale, or proposing to do at scale for DISCO, is that we really do build on developments in related sectors. So drawing on all of this knowledge and experience actually increases the resilience of what we're doing now.
Thank you. Yeah. Katie? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think there's a bit of a difference between digitisation and digital preservation. And I think you're completely right that when we digitise something, we're not getting rid of the original. So we can always go back and re-digitise it if need be, if we try and open the file and it won't open. Whereas when we are creating new research, new data that is created digitally, it presents a much bigger problem because we only have that digital version. And that's where we really need to be thinking about how do we preserve that born digital material for the long run.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to the lady on the left here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Deborah Rowan. I'm a retired archive professional. And I wanted to know if there is much collaboration among different organisations in Scotland and perhaps in the world to fit their specialities in with each other. For instance, Professor Owen's collection of algae and microalgae, could that perhaps link up with Tulane University's type specimens of fish and the Woods Hole marine collections, things like that? Is much of that going on? This also is a matter of preservation because, as we know from places like Ukraine, all you need is one strike on a server and that information is lost forever. So they've been moving Ukrainian cultural information to at least 3 different countries to make sure that it doesn't disappear. Is much of that going on in Scotland?
Thank you for a great question and bringing it right into the present as well. I think, Owen, you wanted to respond first?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, that is a fantastic question. Thanks so much for asking it. One of the possibilities now in the way that we curate both physical and digital collections is that we are able to create stable, permanent links between digital items. And this allows us to curate collections in a way that we never have before. We're right on the brink of really implementing this. In a botanical sense, we are borrowing inspiration from horticulturists who've been curating collections of living plants across multiple climatic zones to ensure the longevity of whole genera or families. And there are quite a few different examples of this. In Edinburgh, we're particularly active in conifer conservation and rhododendron conservation, where gardens across large geographic areas, even globally, are sharing in the effort to conserve particular groups of plants. We're now being inspired by that approach in how we curate herbaria, because we now have digital collections that we can reunite with one another. We can curate collections from a single collector that might be physically scattered in collections across the globe. So this meta-collections approach holds a lot of promise once we have enough digitized specimens. And ditto the same with the digital preservation as well. I think you'll agree that professionally, these are professions that take a long view and know that we are simply the stewards or custodians of a collection, aiming to turn it over in slightly better or hopefully much better condition to the next generation than how we've inherited it. And also as a global community, we're very smart, I think, about rescue efforts and also backups and insurance against worst case scenarios.
Thank you, Owen. Any additions from the panel? Yeah, Nick?
Yeah, just a comment actually about the risks perhaps for living organisms. The person sitting next to you actually is the person that you should talk to about that actually, because he manages our collection very well, and one of the things we're very conscious of is what do you do with living things and keeping them alive. So he'll better tell you the details of that. But you mentioned sort of a time of conflict, if I may, just one of the origins, well, the origin actually of our culture collection was a scientist from Central Europe in the 1930s actually escaped from Central Europe with the origins of the collection in his suitcase and went to Cambridge with that collection. That was the very first, and that was Professor Pringsheim. So we do actually actively consider the risks around losing our collection. So it's a very valid point that you make.
Thank you. Yep.
So another big project in the heritage sector more widely that's recently launched is a thing called the Museum Data Service, which is a really fantastic service if you haven't come across it yet, which just tries to provide an entry point to all the digital records from all the heritage collections. It doesn't do images, but it will point you to where images exist, and it has records. But something they are looking at, and this is, it's run by the Collections Trust and the University of Leicester and a few other people, and one of the things they're looking at, which I think is super interesting, is bringing into that service data and material from exhibitions. So exactly where some of these stories have been brought together and told, and people have loaned items, and people have written content around that, and typically that content disappears afterwards. Or maybe, if we're lucky, it goes in an archive if places have good practice, but often it doesn't, because it's on big boards and it's awkward, and it's been done for a public purpose and it's served that public purpose. But they're looking at finding ways to keep some of that content so that it can then tell some of those stories and be brought together, which I think is a really fantastic thing to do, and I look forward to seeing that develop as a part of digitisation as well.
Thank you very much. Helen, we've got just 7 minutes left. We have some online questions and 2 in the room. And then I want to preserve the time for you to see the exhibition through the doors there. So, Leslie-Anne, could you tell us what's coming online? And then I'll revert to the 2 questions in the room. Thank you.
Just the one question online saying, they assume it's not cheap for institutions to do this digitisation in the first place. So should your organisations be looking to charge users to view or access these images digitally?
That's a fantastic one. I have opinions on the matter. So yes, it's not cheap. Disco UK is £155 million, and that will not digitise even half of the national collections, although we're calling it critical mass. So it probably will result in there being digital records of about half in one way or another. Some of those will be existing data that we help publish rather than new data. And most of that money will go to digitisation, which is very unique for a programme of this type, but it's not cheap. So it's incredibly important to have that critical mass. And I've lost my thread completely. Remind me of the question. Sorry. Paying for it, yes. So we've been asked regularly, should you pay? A couple of things on that. The reason we have a case for these data being impactful is that we have lowered barriers to access to them. So both from an open science moral perspective and from the perspective of many of us being public collections and from the perspective of we're doing this for impact. The minute we charge, we shoot that impact down to a large degree. For all those reasons, I think it's absolutely critical that the basic data are free at the point of use, and that is what we are going to do in Disco. However, you can then build a lot of services and products on the back of them. And we haven't always been very good at recognising that potential. We haven't been very good at negotiating with big tech, for example, who can take those data and do things with them that were unimaginable even 5 years ago. And where we could, if we are smart, if we take advantage of a moment in time, have a dialogue and say, we are generating value for you, we want some of that value back in some form or another. And it might be money, it might be joint research and development, it might be some other kind of contribution. But I really do think we have the opportunity to leverage what we're doing. And we have in Disco UK a thing rather clumsily called the Catalysis Centre, which is a kind of small research centre partly to innovate to speed up digitisation and keep the cost down a bit, and partly to invest in what we do with it and invest in building those partnerships, whether that's academic or commercial or other, to say, okay, there is something we can leverage and get some money back from here. So there will be tiers of activity that might be chargeable, but the basic thing will always be, I hope, free. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and I need the questions to be short. This always happens, doesn't it? So the first question is the gentleman in the jacket there. Yeah.
Can I ask you to pass this along for me?
There's quite a few, but you've waved, so yes, there you go.
Thank you very much. My name is Terry Leventhal. I'm the context as a trustee and board member of Historic Environment Scotland that has collections. So 2 really quick questions. One is around institutional. We're all looking to increase money, to increase commercial revenue. It springs on the back question. So within the digitisation service, how do you convince your colleagues that you're more worthy of investment than they are? Because that's the inevitable institutional question. And then there's another question following from that is the ethics of collection. I run a small charity like Mike. We have a really 150 years old. We have a really interesting collection. And the title of the talk is Towards a National Collection. Inevitably, as we march towards that, the ethics will mean some people are within that tent and others are not. So how, as digital professionals and archival services, do you seek to increase the size of that tent and to help those organisations who have no hope in getting to the standards that you're involved in?
So collaboration, competition, anyone?
Begin, and then perhaps you can give a perspective from a smaller collection. So it's really important to us that Disco UK is not just the Natural History Museum throwing its weight around. And I would like to hope that we have more than 90 institutions around the UK who are actively engaged at the moment, and the model we're taking for Disco UK is a hub and node, for want of a better model. So larger regional collections and in collections in each of the nations of the UK will act as hubs who are actively encouraged in bidding for funding to work with smaller partners around that region, or in a kind of thematic way if that's more appropriate. And in Scotland, as I say, the Botanics and the National Museum are joining forces to be that hub and are already in very active dialogue with a whole range of institutions. So it will cover some of the smallest collections. We have done pilots with tiny collections like Taunton in the southwest, where, yeah, they have a few thousand things. The things are in bad shape. They have nobody except a volunteer looking after them, those kind of things. It is possible to bring those people up to a level where they are creating data that we can use. It's not straightforward. We're trying to strike a balance in our key performance indicators between volume of things digitised, coverage of the UK, coverage of different types of collections, and that kind of inclusion piece about raising capability. So it's not straightforward and it won't cover everybody, but there should be at least the opportunity for everybody to attempt to be part of it, if you see what I mean. We can't make the outcome be the same for everybody, but we can hopefully create that equality of opportunity to a large degree.
You were nodded at, Mike. Do you want to?
I'm fingered on that one. I think probably the thing I hope we can all agree is the value of collections and archives and the importance of them in many different ways. And the challenge for small organisations is very real, but there's a wider context too, and that is that I see a diminution in the skills available out there. A lot of local authorities have been sort of cutting back. There's not the same respect for curatorial skills, I think, that there might have been and probably should be. And I think there's actually a real problem there in how this aspect of knowledge is understood and valued. And I think for us, I think it's actually great that there is a scheme to try to protect and digitise this knowledge nationally. Yes, if it could extend to some of the smaller charities, great. But the reality is actually, I think we've got to remember that wider context. I think we're seeing this dropping back quite significantly in other spaces. And certainly for us, our first love is maps. It's not the only thing we have. But, recently we've had instances of people pulling maps out of skips because people are chucking out so much basic material, and there's another added urgency in my opinion there.
Nikki.
I was just going to say, Within Scotland Soils Archive, we've actually got samples that people have given us, and if they come into a threshold of the amount of data that's there that backs them up and that we know about them, then actually we could take the samples and look after them within the archive. For example, there's the soil samples from the equine grass sickness, and so their samples are actually within the National Soils Archive as just one example.
Thank you very much. So we have a final question at the back. Yeah, if you could go around with the mic. Thanks, Leslie Ann, you're doing a great job.
Hello, Dermot Hearns, National Trust for Scotland. We're more on the cultural heritage side in terms of digitisation at the moment. We've digitised recently our Robert Burns commonplace books, which has a lot of advantages because the originals are very delicate and people can access most of the information from that. But we had a lot of soul searching about licensing, fair use agreements, and we've kind of got to a position we're happy with, but we're very much geared towards human users respecting those agreements. I'm interested in the panel, what their thoughts are about machines accessing these collections, taking the basic access, scraping all the data, taking it somewhere else, combining it with another data set, creating a third data set. Do you see the machines using your collections in a different way to perhaps to human users at present, for good or bad?
So that's just a small question for the end, isn't it? If you could give brief answers now, but you will be able to come forward and speak to the panellists, but I'm sure we all want to hear the answer to this one. Who would like to go first? Mike, go on.
I don't know how to answer that other than ultimately it's about integrity, and I think that's the issue, isn't it? About how do you, it comes back to that comment you were making earlier about Mercedes-Benz. Where do you prove the information knowledge has come from, and how do you ensure it retains that integrity? I don't know the answer, I'm afraid.
I have opinions on this as well. I have opinions on everything. So I am possibly naively optimistic on this point as well. So I think these are tools, people can do bad things with them and good things with them, right? So, and I've seen so many amazing examples of what can be done in this space using these data in novel ways at scale with technology that I'm very encouraged by those things and what they offer as possibilities. So the ability to identify things much more easily is really valuable, for example, and can be really enhanced by AI. It is a worry. So already these data are getting scraped, right? That's happening. We can't stop it. If you put it out there, it's going to happen. We don't have so much the rights issue in terms of most of these objects have no copyright in them and the images have no copyright because they're scientifically accurate. They're not an artistic portrayal, which saves us some headache to a degree. We have some issues with living collectors and things, but on the whole, we don't have too many personal data issues either. So we're lucky compared to some types of collections in what we digitize. But we do have things which have that physical voucher as provenance. And if they are too much pulled away and misinterpreted, they lose value. And so I think, to me, there is that opportunity for that debate that says, if you talk to us, if you draw on our expertise to help you use and curate those things that you can just take, but we can make your use of them much more valuable if you return some of that value to us. And I think that is an understood point. We have had people approach us about this and kind of say, yes, this is a great data set, but it's not so great if you don't really know what you're looking at, because it is some of it quite esoteric as well. So it will happen, but I think we have, in many ways, a better provenance story than a lot of things, and an ability to leverage the things we know to add value to that offering.
Thank you, Helen. Eileen, I can't help but see you nodding vigorously. Do you want to add to that, or has it been said?
I think for me, it's about that interpretation and the integrity of that and how rich the value add of working together on it. There will be misusers, but on the whole, I think the value in reinterpreting, reimagining what you can get from those combined sources and combined artificial but also real world intellect is where we're going to go. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I'm going to stick with Helen on this one.
There's some really good work going on as well about standards for tracing digital provenance better. So things that have been developed, for example, to protect journalists in war-torn parts of the world, so they can have image rights without being associated, traceable through that. Those kind of technologies can be brought into this space eventually to say, so that when someone makes an AI image, and it's using a bit of one of our photos, we will know in future. It's going to get better, that ability to trace that. It's already, there's some really good work in that space. We can't implement that today, but I think we'll be able to in maybe 2 to 5 years' time.
Great, thank you. Please all stay there. Don't run away. I'm going to ask Professor Lee Innes not to sum up, that would be impossible, but to give us some remarks, and then I'll formally close our evening. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, and huge thanks to the panel. That was just such a fascinating evening. As Sarah said, I'm not going to sum up. I'm not going to try and sum up. But there's so many things I'm sure will make you go away and think, and I'm sure the panel are here for a bit if you want to ask some extra questions. But I really just wanted to thank all of our speakers and the panel for an absolutely fascinating event. Really enjoyed it. I also wanted to thank very much my colleagues at SCRR and RSE for all the hard work in organising this event. Particularly I want to thank Leslie Ann and the local team. If you happen to give Leslie Ann a round of applause, please do. She has been absolutely brilliant in setting this all up and the exhibition. I'd also like to thank Katie Dubarry, who's here in the audience, who has organised a special early career researchers group this afternoon. So thank you very much, Katie, and all of the early career scientists took part this afternoon. Thank you. And finally, I'd really like to thank you, the audience, for coming along to the event and your participation, and the audience online. Thank you very much for participating. We hope you enjoyed it. And just finally, I just want to say, I think the exhibition is still on, if you want to go through, and I think there's some refreshments as well. So thanks very much to Sarah and her colleagues, and I'd like to wish you all a very good evening and safe journey home. Thank you.